Okay, so I was thinking the other day about how one brother in particular of mine, who basically had very similar upbringing overall, consistently tends to think that we both had similar social exposure because of that. And so he's naturally very talkative and really good at interacting with other people, while I tend to be a bit more conserved. And instead of considering the differences between male and female and the way that we were brought up in a patriarchal, very conservative cult, he just assumes it's because I chose not to. But the reality is that the way we were raised is that men are supposed to take positions of leadership, and that starts from a very young age. And so my brother always went along with our dad to do different events and to basically represent family-run businesses that we had and stuff like that. Well, of course, I was expected to stay at home and learn along with my sisters from our mom about food prep and taking care of a home and whatnot. And from the outside looking in, a complete stranger who would come in and say, visit the conference center that we grew up at, they might think we still had exposure to people from different walks of life, which was true. But the other assumption related to that is also that having such exposure means that you would actually learn how to talk. And that was not true, because in my case, there was an expectation that I would keep to myself and not be as involved with those other people, because then I would be at high risk of maybe sinning. So despite the fact that my parents recognized the goal was for me to help represent Christ and the belief system that I was raised with, there was also concern, specifically because I was a female, that I would not be able to speak out for myself and continue those beliefs unless I was very sheltered. And this also meant that because my brother was a male, he was assumed to have a greater strength with that, and that meant he did not have to have as much sheltering and would be exposed to those social situations more. Thanks to my background in psychology from studying it in college, I'm aware of the assumed similarity bias and naive realism, which are both at play here, and I think deserve a lot of credit for the way that my brother assumes that I would have had the same experience as him, on top of the general way that it was reinforced that we would have the same experience as another way to gaslight everyone to believe that it was a community of fairness and justice, because that is what was needed to be able to keep us all together and continue staying in the cult. I can't speak exactly to how this brother thinks now because, well, we are in somewhat contact. I haven't seen him in person in a few years, but the last times that I had seen him, when I try to approach anything related to this, he definitely still brings it up like my childhood was the same as his, and so I must have the same exact issues and challenges as him. And while I can see that he's trying to find common ground with that, it's also a bit dismissive of the fact that other people could have had different experiences, which was the reality for me. And I guess one benefit to this is it was an early lesson for me on the fact that people have very different perspectives, and a reminder that just because somebody dismisses you, it's clear when it's because that's their assumption and not necessarily because what you're thinking isn't worth anything or of value. You definitely should be considering how things impact you, because that's your reality, even if somebody else denies it. And considering that all of us are on different walks of life, I do see growth in my siblings, including this brother, and hopefully in the future there's some resolution where we can find common ground in these areas. But for now, I do understand that, especially considering that some of my siblings are still within very similar communities to the cult that we grew up in, even though they all would be considered people who left, Some still think very conservatively, including this brother. And that plays a really big role into the fact that he has normalized some of those beliefs that we grew up with, and they work for him, so he tends to think that they will work for other people. And that, unfortunately, for our relationship is not true for me. And I guess everybody has to work through and live the reality that works best for them. And as I reflect on my upbringing and then what actually started me down the path of considering leaving home to begin with, it is interesting to reflect that my exposure to people from so many different walks of life who came through at various times of the year did kind of prime me to realize that there were other viewpoints, but it didn't actually become the primary reason why I wanted to leave home. It turned into much more of just a safety net and a bit of a reassurance that people who actually care are out there, and my family was an anomaly and a very bad one. As always, I feel obligated to include a little caveat and reminder here that just because I might appear to speak more normally and be socially interactive today, that is not proof of the homeschooling that my parents chose being the appropriate choice. This is the end result of me having already been gone from home for over 10 years now, during which I was forced to have daily exposure with other people much more regularly. Because during my upbringing, besides a few people from outside who would come into retreats and such, it was mainly other homeschoolers, which does normalize a very awkward and weird type of environment. And this should make sense considering that my parents were part of a cult and raising me within that, and a very big part of it was to be high control and ensure that the followers had no reason to want to leave. And I'm saying this because I realize that even though I do want to educate people, there are going to be viewers who automatically think, oh, I turned out so great, and I should not be upset with my parents for what they did, because clearly I can talk now and communicate with people. But this is a little PSA that there's always more going on behind the scenes than what you think, and you should not just judge somebody based on what they're posting online and the little bit that you know about them, because that's just a little piece of the entire pie that represents their life. Another point that is really key to mention here is that not just the one brother I've been discussing mostly, but all of my brothers, even ones who have truly left the cult and decided to take other paths, still tend to have this mindset as a male where you have greater value, and it's very patriarchal in nature, which again was encouraged by the cult we were raised in. And it is interesting to consider that they all have these inbuilt mindsets based on that because it benefits them, and that's why they've continued it even when they have left the cult. Because leadership is seen as such a strength for men, both in a very patriarchal society as part of a cult, as well as mainstream society, because patriarchy is still very well alive. And that basically means that continuing those leadership patterns and recognition and the presumptions that you are of very high value is incredibly beneficial to them and easy to do because that's how they were raised. In comparison, the experience for myself and even a few sisters who decided to leave and pursue higher education, it has been astronomically different and so much more difficult for us because we were raised in an environment that did not encourage those leadership skills and what was necessary to be able to make it out in society as just an individual, because we were raised with such a heavy emphasis on learning how to be led by the instruction of your father and brothers, and then being transferred over to your husband when you did eventually get married, because that was always the goal. And one big way that this was reinforced growing up was that in order to ensure for me that I followed rules, it wasn't just my dad and my mom, of course, because she was always supportive of what he wanted. It was also my brothers helping to track things and make sure that the girls were always being kept in line. And I can recall several instances where the brother right above me would actually report when he thought that I had done something incorrect, and then get recognized in a positive light by my father for that reason, and then I would get punished for it. And several of these instances involved specific times when I would be trying to get a better education compared to what my brother had been okay with, because his path was to learn more leadership skills and basic things to do with the family business, and that was always his plan, which he was okay with. Whereas I had a very strong drive to excel in academics, and so I really wanted to invest time in learning the sciences and math. And I recall one particular afternoon or evening, I believe, when I was doing some review with an old textbook. I believe it was in general chemistry. And I remember my brother happening to come upon me while I was doing that and creating such a dramatic response, for no reason, except that he had been indoctrinated to do so as the person who was basically supervising me. And he was like, "Oh no, I'm gonna have to tell our parents that you were doing that." And he talked about it like it was such a big deal and basically a sin that I was seeking out higher education that could potentially help me to make it in the outside world, which was considered full of sinners and not safe for a female. And he told on me, and I directly remember my father surprisingly not being angry enough to bring out the wooden stick or spatula that he would use, or his shoe, but giving me a very stern lecture that it wasn't necessary and I should not be caught reviewing a book like that again. And after a few different instances like that had occurred, I specifically recall a turning point where my time was forced to be spent more on helping with family-related things, and that specifically worked out so great so that my father got more free assistance from me, since we were barely being paid anything to help with family business stuff. And then that was less time that I could spend seeking out academic improvement in different areas.